Tonight's meeting is the first in our yearly series, which celebrates NPAP's 60th anniversary and Theodore Reich's 120th birthday. And it's entitled, Instinct or Intellect, Must We Choose? On November 14th, here in this auditorium, Marcia Cavell will be presenting Musical Improvisation and the Psychoanalytic Process, with Gerald Gargiulio as the discussant. If anyone would like to be added to our mailing list, please leave your name and current email address on the list provided outside the hall on the table by the door. And if anyone would like notice of a new book from Guilford Press on the collected papers of Oscar Sternbach, there's a separate list. Also, following the meeting, you're all invited to stay for a collation outside the auditorium. And I'd like to announce a first for NPAP. Tonight's meeting is being webcast by Fora TV and will be available for viewing on the New School website, on Fora TV, that's F-O-R-A, you can Google it, website, and then hopefully on NPAP's website. I think that's it for the announcements. So, tonight, it is my great privilege to introduce Dr. Otto F. Kernberg. To psychoanalysts the world over, Dr. Kernberg needs little introduction. To my mind, he is the foremost psychoanalytic thinker alive today. Dr. Leo Rangel has suggested that the future impact of psychoanalysis will be in the area of psychotherapy. And Dr. Kernberg has, for over a quarter of a century, been developing what he calls transference-focused psychotherapy. I'm sure that our title for this year's series, Instinct or Intellect, Must We Choose, is a question that Dr. Kernberg has long since resolved. When I began my training almost 30 years ago, Dr. Kernberg was already synthesizing as well as integrating the various theoretical lines that had been developing over the course of the history of psychoanalysis. The simplistic dichotomy we all remember of Kernberg versus Kohut was always a misnomer, foisted on our field by practitioners looking for an easy way to understand the human psyche. Another similar misnomer, ego psychology, led to the disappointing separation of drives from objects. But Dr. Kernberg steadfastly developed his own version of object relations theory that never lost sight of the obvious connection between these two ideas. With well over 20 books in print, and I assume more to come, Dr. Kernberg has been the model for being ahead of the curve. Long before Melanie Klein was accepted in this country, Dr. Kernberg judiciously laid out a translation of her work that over the last few years has become readily acceptable to whatever today is called the mainstream in psychoanalytic thought. Dr. Kernberg was born in Vienna, as was Oscar Sternbach. However, at the age of 10, the Kernberg family emigrated to Chile, where Dr. Kernberg was eventually to receive both his medical degree and his psychoanalytic training, finishing in 1960. From there, he became a staff psychiatrist in the research department at the Menninger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas. And by 1966, he became the chief investigator of the now famous psychotherapy research project at Menninger. Many of you may know of this work through Bob Wallerstein's book, 40 Lives in Treatment. And by 1969, he was appointed as the director of the Menninger Foundation. In 1973, he moved to New York as the director of General Clinical Services at New York State Psychiatric Institute, and also became affiliated with Columbia Psychoanalytic. 3 years later, he was named the medical director of the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center. And by the mid-'80s, he was named the associate chair. By this time, he had been elected vice president of the International. and then became president of the International Psychoanalytical Association in 1997. As analysts, we have all been aware of Dr. Kernberg's prolific and integrated body of work, which he has astonishingly produced consistently for over 40 years. I cannot, in a short time, do justice in this introduction to this body of psychoanalytic literature. In our current age of diminished psychoanalytic publishing, Dr. Kernberg is one of the very few psychoanalysts who can currently have their books published by a major publishing house. Over the last 40 years, Dr. Kernberg has received over 50 honors, from the Best Teacher of the Year Award at Menninger in 1968, to the Heinz Hartmann Award in 1972, to the Edward A. Strecker Award in 1975, to the Golden Medal of Honor to the City of Vienna in 2007, to which we add this evening the Oscar Sternbach Memorial Award. Year after year, his integrating method of bringing together drives, object relations, ego, and neuroscientific principles has supported a wide array of most important papers. From his two now classic books, Borderline Conditions and Pathological Narcissism in 1975, and Object Relations Theory and Clinical Psychoanalysis in 1976, to writing the foreword to Janine Chasquet-Schmergel's Creativity and Perversion in 1983, to his beautiful paper on mourning last spring, to summarizing Jaak Panksepp and Doug Watt's breakthrough paper on the evolutionary aspects of depression for our study group just 2 weeks ago, to discussing Henry Smith's paper on forgiveness next Saturday morning for IPTAR, and to chairing a roundtable at the Philoctetes Center on paraphilias that same afternoon. Dr. Kernberg has revealed to my mind an extraordinary capacity to view psychoanalytic theory and praxis from a position that encompasses the possibility of achieving what Leo Rangel proposed 3 years ago right here in this auditorium, a total composite psychoanalytic theory. His legacy, Dr. Kernberg's, while still being written, includes major contributions to internal object relations theory, psychoanalytic education, psychoanalytic administration, psychoanalytic research models, as well as research results, and what may in the future be the most crucial, his development along with his close colleagues, two of whom are here with us this evening, John Clarkin and Catherine Herron, of TFP, Transference-Focused Psychotherapy, which has been the major focus of his work since 1995 as director of the Personality Disorders Institute, New York Presbyterian Hospital in Westchester. In my 30 years in the field of psychoanalysis, I have yet to meet a man more steeped in the understanding of what psychoanalysis is, and at the same time helping psychoanalysis to shape itself into what it will become in the future. His thorough understanding of all major and minor schools in our ever-expanding universe is not only encyclopedic, but he makes it understandable, whether it be Latin American versions of Kleinian praxis, or the Lacanian version of a one-person psychology, or the distinction in current English schools between attachment theories of Fonagy versus Marjorie Main. He synthesizes and integrates what many of us are just trying to get our minds around. In our study group, I have been fortunate to see this occur in real time, and I never fail to be amazed by him. 28 years ago, I took my first Freud course at NPAP. The teacher asked the class if we believed in the death instinct. In my even less than novice state at the time, I immediately put down my head to avoid being called on. No such luck. I was asked first, and I had no idea. But I answered anyway. I don't even remember which way I answered. I just wanted out. For the next 28 years, I struggled in private trying to answer that question. However, after I read the paper that you're all about to hear, I finally had my answer. And with that, it is my great privilege and honor, and with many thanks, to introduce Dr. Otto F. Kernberg.
Thank you very much for your more than kind introduction, and it stimulated me to write about the subject of idealization. It made me feel anxious thinking of all the work that's unfinished and questionable and to do. So I'll have a sleepless night. I'm really very appreciative for your kind words. It has been a great pleasure to be able to work with you in our study group, and you have very modestly avoided talking about your own important and thoughtful contributions to it, for which all of us have been grateful. And it's also a great pleasure that an unexpected pleasure to have here in the audience my closest colleague and co-worker over many years, who has been in charge of all the development of the methodology of research, and is really has been the pillar that has been moving all of us to develop transference-focused psychotherapy into the scientific realm with empirical studies that have now been recognized and acknowledged in the various major psychoanalytic and psychiatric journals. So I want to thank here John Clark, and very happy that you're here. I can't resist the temptation to say that it is always said of John, who is a background in cognitive behavior therapy, that he's a closet psychoanalyst, and of me it has been said that I'm a closet cognitive behavior therapist. In addition to be a closet Kleinian. Okay. I want to congratulate NPAP for the 60th birthday. I wasn't aware of it. Congratulations. It is the beginning of adulthood, as I can tell you from my own experience. And I would like to thank for the invitation Dr. Paul Kaiser, your president, and of course the program committee, of which Karl is the chair. And the Oskar Sternbach Memorial Lecture, I read anxiously the excellent paper by Dr. Sternbach about the death drive before coming tonight. I found it very stimulating, very interesting, but I was relieved that he didn't say everything, and so with this I start. The Death Drive, a contemporary view of the controversy. He wrote his paper in 1975 before anybody was really concerned about how to review the concept. This was a revolutionary new view for those of you who may perhaps not be aware of it. Can you hear me well in the last row? Okay, yeah. I believe that it is quite evident that the two major controversies that have been raised by Freud's monumental discovery are his theory of libido, or the sexual drive, and his theory of the death drive, representing respectively the struggle between life as centered in erotic impulses and aggression. Freud considered both drives as the fundamental motivational principles determining unconscious conflict and symptom formation. In a broader sense, they were what drive human beings toward the search for gratification and happiness on the one hand, and to severely destructive and self-destructive aggression on the other. Freud's stress on the infantile origins of sexual orientation, infantile sexuality, and particularly its sadomasochistic components, have raised shock, opposition, and efforts at denial in the general culture. The death drive runs deeply against more optimistic views of human nature, based on the assumption that if severe frustrations or trauma were absent in early development, then aggression would not be a major human problem. These perennial cultural reactions toward Freud's theories are mirrored within the psychoanalytic community proper. Recent tendencies, particularly in American psychoanalysis, reflected by the relational approach, tend to de-emphasize both infantile sexuality and aggression, in contrast to their centrality in the psychoanalytic focus in European and Latin American psychoanalytic contributions. Additionally, Freud's concept of the death drive has been questioned within American ego psychology, and the debate about whether aggression is primary or a secondary response to trauma and frustration permeates the psychological field widely beyond psychoanalysis proper. In this paper, I wish to focus exclusively on the controversies surrounding Freud's theory of the death drive. The importance of this controversy relates directly to the social and cultural problems of the 20th century and the beginning of this new century. The fundamentalist regimes of the last century were unprecedented in their primitive and brutal aggression, both systematic and daily. The tens of millions killed in the name of German National Socialism and Marxist communism are beginning to be replicated under the banner of political Islam. But no society, no country is free of the history of senseless wholesale massacre of imagined or real enemies. The relative ubiquity of these phenomena throughout the history of civilization cannot be ignored. The question of the existence of the death drive as part of the core of human psychology is unfortunately a practical and not merely a theoretical problem. To begin, regarding Freud's theory of motivation, the study of the unconscious conflicts that patients with neurotic syndromes and character pathology experience led Freud to successive formulations regarding the ultimate drives, culminating in the dual drive theory of libido and the death drive. The practical implication of these proposed two major motivational systems is that, as mentioned before, at the bottom, all unconscious conflicts involve conflicts between love and aggression at some level of development. This, I believe, makes eminent sense clinically, and so does Freud's careful warning that the only thing we know about these two drives are their expression in mental representations and affects. Here begins the problem. Freud had postponed linking psychological functions and structures with underlying neurobiological developments because of the primitive nature of the neurobiology of his time. He expressed the hope, however, that eventually more specific relationships between psychological functions and neurobiological developments might become clearer. From today's developments in neurobiological science and advances in our knowledge about instinctive behavior and its organization in mammals, particularly primates, it emerges that the primary motivational systems consist of affects of positive and negative kind. Affects are primary motivational systems in the sense that their activation under certain circumstances by mechanisms of the limbic brain initiates strong motivation to movement toward other objects or away from them. The entire series of libidinal affects, joyous encounter, euphoria, sensual gratification, and erotic arousal are all directed toward early libidinal objects, while the negative affects of rage, anger, disgust, anxiety, and later envy and hatred motivate us to withdraw from dangerous objects or attempt to control or eliminate them. All affects are embedded in mental representations, that is, a cognitive organization of the context in which affects emerge, an emerging definition of the desired objects, as well as of the feared and hated ones, and wishful fantasies toward erotic objects, as well as about the elimination of threatening objects. The very fantasies that reflect unconscious conflicts between love and hatred are always representations embedded in respective positive or negative affects. In the study of patients with severe psychopathology, the borderline conditions, at the Institute of Personality Disorders at the Weill Cornell Medical College, we have been able to confirm that borderline patients who suffer from inordinate aggressive impulses and lack of impulse control, in other words, a strong predominance of negative affects and impulsivity, regularly show hyperactivity of the amygdala, a limbic structure related to the activation of negative affect. They also show a primary inhibition of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that is related to cognitive framing of affects and the establishment of priorities of focus, attention, and action following such affective activation. These and other related findings have been confirmed also in various other centers, so that we are at the beginning of establishing a more direct relationship between neurobiological function and affect activation. But what does all of this say to the theory of drives? The psychoanalytic community is struggling nowadays with the problem of whether drives should continue to be considered as the primary motivational systems, or whether they should be replaced by the consideration of affects as primary motivational systems. The absence of any biological evidence for the original primary nature of drives, the abundant evidence for the primary motivational functions of affects, and the fact that affects always imply representations at the same time, raise the question whether affective representations are the building blocks of more complex human motivational developments, thus replacing the concept of drives. Against such a radical assumption lies the fact that clinically, the replacement of drive theory by affect theory does not do justice to the stable organization of unconscious conflicts. The multiplicity of affects and the shifting affective relationship to objects and their representations does not lend itself to meaningful conceptualization of the organization of these conflicts. On the other hand, a pure drive theory that does not consider the specific vicissitudes of affects tends to acquire overgeneralized and rigidly dogmatic aspects that also runs counter to clinical experience. To explain unconscious conflict as simple struggles between libido and aggressive drives does not do justice to the complexity of clinical experience. I've proposed years ago, and am no longer alone in this view, that affects constitute the primary motivational system and that they are integrated into supraordinate positive and negative drives, namely libido and aggression. The drives, in turn, manifest themselves as activation of their constituent affects with varying intensity along the line of libidinal and aggressive investments. In short, I believe that affects are the primary motivators. They organize into hierarchically supraordinate motivations, or the Freudian drives, and the drives in turn become activated in the form of their component, affectively valenced representations manifest as unconscious fantasies. It will be noticed that I've talked about aggression and then aggressive drive rather than death drive per se. That our patients suffer from conflicts involving love and aggression, from their ambivalence toward those they love and need and to gratify and frustrate them, who can never satisfy all desires and sometimes dramatically withhold the gratification of basic psychological needs, seems reasonable enough. We are talking here about aggression secondary to frustration, which conforms with the type of aggression delineated by Freud as arising from the conflict between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. And the basis of such aggression, mingling with our deepest needs for closeness and love, naturally may be related to the biological disposition to aggression, as inborn as that to love and eroticism of which we encounter as a common property of all mammals. I'm referring to the aggressive disposition that are a normal mechanism in the defense of the newly born mammal and its early development that requires parental protection. The aggression at the service of territoriality that protects the sources of nutrition, and the aggressive disposition involved in the competition of males for the possession of females. These biologically anchored instincts have the correspondent instinctive dispositions in human beings as well, and explain the mechanism of aggression secondary to danger or frustration. But Freud discovered clinical phenomena in which aggression could not be accounted for by mere frustration of the pleasure principle and became an overriding, self-destructive motivation that proved to offer enormous resistances to its modification in psychoanalytic treatment. The clinical experience accumulated throughout time on the basis of psychoanalytic practice has added new evidence in support of the prevalence of severely self-destructive psychopathological constellations, indirectly supporting the theory of a death drive. The phenomena that led Freud to the establishment and later to the reinforcement of the hypothesis of the death drive as opposed to a simple aggressive drive include the following. First, the phenomenon of repetition compulsion. Second, sadism and masochism. Third, negative therapeutic reaction. Fourth, suicide in severe depression, and we may add in non-depressive characterological structures. Fifth, destructive and self-destructive developments in group processes and their social implications. Let us examine them. First, regarding repetition compulsion, the main clinical constellation referred to by Freud in his original proposal. As the name implies, the patient engages in an endless repetition of the same, usually destructive behavior that resists the interpretation of assumed and very often well-documented unconscious conflicts involved. Originally described as the, quote, resistance of the id, close quote, a somewhat mysterious force from the dynamic unconscious, clinical experience has demonstrated that repetition compulsion may have multiple functions that have different prognostic implications. Sometimes it is simply the repetitive working through of a conflict that demands patience and gradual elaboration. At other times, it represents the unconscious repetition of a traumatic relationship with a frustrating or traumatizing object, with the hidden hope that quote, this time, close quote, the other will gratify the needs and wishes of the patient, thus being transformed at last into much needed good object. Many unconscious fixations to traumatic situations have this origin, although sometimes they may reflect more primitive neurobiological processes. These primitive processes deal with the incessant rekindling of a very early behavioral chain deeply ingrained in the limbic structures and their neural connections with the prefrontal and preorbital cortex. In many cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, we find that repetition compulsion is an effort to come to terms with an originally overwhelming situation. If such a repetition compulsion is tolerated and facilitated in the context of a safe and protective environment, gradual resolution may obtain. In other cases, however, particularly when post-traumatic stress syndrome is no longer an active syndrome but operates an etiological factor behind severe characterological distortions, the repetition compulsion may reflect an effort to overcome the traumatic situation by an unconscious identification with the source of trauma. Here the patient identifies with the perpetrator of the trauma while projecting on somebody else the function of victim. It is as if the world had become exclusively a relationship between perpetrators and victims, and the patient unconsciously repeats the traumatic situation in an effort to reverse the roles and place somebody else in the role of victim. The unconscious triumph that such a reversal may provide of the patient then maintains repetition compulsion endlessly. There are still more malignant cases of repetition compulsions, such as the unconscious effort to destroy a potentially helpful relationship out of an unconscious sense of triumph over the person who tries to help, who is envied for not having suffered what the patient in his mind has suffered. It is an unconscious triumph which at the same time coincides, of course, with the defeat of the patient himself. Andre Green, a leading contributor to the exploration of severe psychopathologies, has described the unconscious identification with a, quote, dead mother, close quote, that is, a severely depressed mother who had chronically frustrated the needs for love and dependency for her infantile child. At the same time, such a mother, desperately needed, cannot be abandoned. The patient, in unconscious identification with a fancied dead mother, denies the existence of all live relationships in reality as if he himself were dead to the world. In patients with severe narcissistic pathology, repetition compulsion may have the function of an active destruction of the passage of time, as an expression of denial of aging and death, combined with the triumphant destruction of the work of the envied therapist. Repetition compulsion, in short, provides clinical support to the theory of a relentless self-destructive motivation, one of the sources of the concept of the death drive. Severe manifestations of sexual sadism and masochism are a second type of a fundamental drive to self-destruct. Cases of sexual perversion, that is, a significant restriction of sexual behavior to a specific interaction that becomes an indispensable condition for sexual excitement and orgasm, may be linked to a dangerously sadistic or masochistic behavior, reflected in severe self-injurious or self-mutilating behavior as a precondition for sexual enjoyment. Inordinate cruelty to others and inordinate cruelty toward the self often are combined in the most severe cases. Patients with borderline psychopathology often show severe self-mutilation, cutting, burning, and in the most severe cases, self-mutilation leading to the loss of limbs as a relentless drive which at times causes all therapeutic efforts to fail. The frequent syndrome of anorexia nervosa, particularly in its most severe manifestations, also may correspond to such relentless, irreducible self-destructiveness. One clinical syndrome that is particularly difficult to handle is that of perversity, not sexual perversion. Perversity involves the recruitment of love at the service of aggression, the effort to seduce another person toward love or helpfulness as a trap that will end with a destruction, symbolic or real, in a social and sometimes in a physical sense of the person so seduced. In normal love relations, small doses of aggression intensify erotic pleasure. However, under pathological conditions, perversity may destroy erotic pleasure and even more so its object. The mildest cases of all these sadomasochistic developments are found in those patients who, because of unconscious guilt, usually related to profoundly forbidden edible urges or unconscious aggression to an early object of their dependence and needs, destroy what they received. These developments are easier to understand and to treat. Here, self-destructiveness has the function of the price, unquote, that must be paid in order to permit a gratifying relationship to develop, and doesn't have the primary function of destruction of a potentially good relationship. This brings us to the third type of manifestation of severe self-directed aggression, namely the negative therapeutic reaction. Freud described one type of negative therapeutic reaction in his clinical observation of patients who appear to get worse under condition when they experienced a helpful intervention by the analyst, as an expression of unconscious guilt over being helped. Negative therapeutic reaction out of unconscious guilt is in effect the mildest form of this reaction. A much more frequent and more severe, although eminently treatable form, is the negative therapeutic reaction out of unconscious envy of the therapist, particularly characteristic of narcissistic patients. It is an expression of the humiliating envy on the part of the narcissistic patient of the therapist's capacity to help him, of the analyst's creativity in his efforts to help the patient. There's an even more severe form of negative therapeutic reaction, and this one has the unmistakable signs of a highly motivated self-destructiveness, namely an unconscious identification with an extremely sadistic object, so that it is as if the patient felt that the only real relationship that he may have is with somebody who destroys him. This dynamic constellation is prevalent in the cases presenting severe self-mutilating behavior. One patient successfully cut off segments of fingers of her hands and severed major nerves in one arm. She presented the syndrome of malignant narcissism, and her psychoanalytic psychotherapy was carried out in part during extended hospitalization. She was not psychotic at any point. In the transference, the identification with an extremely aggressive and incestuous paternal image was a dominant element. It is difficult to understand this development from a position of ordinary common sense, but there are patients who relentlessly provoke the analyst until the analyst succumbs to an uncontainable negative countertransference reaction. The analyst, maneuvered into a countertransference enactment, manifests some negative behavior to which the patient triumphantly responds with further escalation of this provocative self-destructive behavior. Very often this treatment ends precipitously, leaving the therapist with a sense of impotence, frustration, and guilt feelings. These patients represent severe borderline conditions in what I've described as a syndrome of malignant narcissism, that is, patients with severe narcissistic features, paranoid tendencies, egocentric aggression against self and others, and antisocial behavior. These patients may utilize the treatment as a perversely gratifying form of self-destruction because they draw others into their daily self-attacks. One of our patients presenting the syndrome repeatedly consumed rat poison, which interferes with blood clotting to the extent of provoking severe internal hemorrhages, while she smilingly denied to her therapist and to the staff that she had done so. even hospitalized, and with a prothrombin time extending by the day and careful searches by the nursing staff, we were not able to control the self-mutilating behavior and the pleasurable nature with which this patient expressed it, to the extent that finally she was transferred for custodial care to another institution. A fourth type of severe self-destructive impulse is reflected in suicidal urges and behavior. Freud considered suicidal tendencies in melancholia as another expression of the death drive. He described the essential mechanism of this development as the introjection of an ambivalently loved and lost object that then would draw the aggression toward that object into the ego, which is now identified with the lost object. The work of Melanie Klein showed that such ambivalence is a normal aspect of all love relations. She described the task of the depressive position in overcoming the split between positive, idealized internal relations with the object and aggressively invested and projected relation with the objects of a persecutory type. She described, in short, the normal integration between split-off, idealized and paranoid relationships as part of normal development, the depressive position, in contrast to the earlier, splitting-dominated, paranoid schizoid position. This integration, Melanie Klein proposed convincingly, constitutes a normal early developmental phase repeated in all later mourning processes, so that in all losses there is not only the loss of an external object and the working through of that loss by its internalization, but a reactivation of the depressive position with the working through of ambivalences toward all earlier object losses. In short, normal ambivalence is an unavoidable aspect of all mourning reactions. It is only under conditions of severe aggressive, particularly unconsciously aggressive impulses toward the lost object, where the pathology of the depressive position evolves in the form of relentless self-attacks, now derived from the internalization of aggressive aspects of the object into the superego, and an attack of the self from the superego and the simultaneous identification of the object with the ego or the self. This combination leads to potentially severely dangerous and very often actualized suicidal tendencies. But we do find such self-destructive suicidal behavior also in patients who are not depressed, precisely in severe narcissistic personalities. Here, a sense of defeat, failure, humiliation, in essence, the loss of their grandiosity, may bring about not only feelings of extremely devastating, shameful defeat and inferiority, but a compensatory sense of triumph over reality by taking their own life, thus demonstrating to themselves and to the world that they are not afraid of pain and death. To the contrary, death emerges as an even elegant abandonment of a depreciated, worthless world. We've seen that severe self-destructive psychopathology warrants the clinical assumption of powerful, sometimes uncontrollable self-destructive impulses reflected in the phenomena of repetition compulsion, sadism and masochism, negative therapeutic reaction and suicide, both in severe depression as well as in other forms of psychopathology. But in addition, Freud also described severe self-destructiveness as a social phenomenon in the behavior of large social group processes, in human masses as ideologically united conglomerates, in mutual identification with a grandiose and aggressive leader. In this process, the group projects the individual superego functions onto the group leader, with the consequence of group-sanctioned expression of primitive, ordinarily suppressed impulses, particularly of an aggressive type. A mass movement may coalesce around the drive to search and destroy enemy formations, a sense of power derived from the liberated, now focused aggression, their sense of protected dependency by their allegiance to the leader, and the regression to the most primitive dissociation of object relations into idealized and persecutory ones. This development represented for Freud the activation of severe destructiveness at a social level. The projection of the superego onto the leader, the mutual identification of all participants with him or her, as well as the sanctioned expression of aggression, are the fundamental explanation for the aggressive behavior of mass movements and large social structures, applying even to international conflict. But the aggression activated in regressive group processes may also be channeled onto the group itself, guided by a grandiose, self-destructive leader, ending in a religiously or ideologically rationalized mass suicide. Freud's theory of mass psychology, dramatically demonstrated in 1,000 forms in the mass psychology of the fundamentalist movement of the last century, has been complemented by Bion's work with small groups and Pierre Turquet's and Didier Anzieu's with large groups. I do not have space here to describe in detail all these findings, but would summarize them by stating that when small or large groups are unstructured, that is, without a clear task and its corresponding structure relating that group constructively to its environment, and when in contrast, the only task of such groups is meeting to study their own reaction for, say, an hour and a half during a sequence of several days or a few weeks, they present striking and similar phenomena. They show the immediate activation of intense anxiety and an effort to escape that anxiety by some soothing ad hoc philosophy expounded by a friendly, mediocre, grandfatherly leader who calms down the group's anxieties with cliches. When this effort fails, they show a tendency to the development of intense violence, the search for a paranoid leader, the division of the group itself, or its perception of the surrounding social environment into an idealized and a persecutory one, with active aggression directed against what is perceived as the hostile segment of the world in order to protect the perfection and the security of the ideal group. Vamik Volkan, who has applied psychoanalytic theory to the study of intergroup and international conflicts, has expanded these observations by systematically studying the nature of the ideal world of fundamentalist groups, the reason for the need to search for and destroy enemies, their striving to preserve rigid boundaries and the purity of their group, and the obvious connection between these categories and fundamentalist political, racial, and religious movements. In conclusion of this point, there is impressive clinical and sociological evidence for a universal potential for violence in human beings that can be triggered too easily under certain conditions of group regression and corresponding leadership, and that from the perspective of the survival of human societies may be considered as fundamentally self-destructive. These are the leading clinical arguments in support of Freud's theory of the death drive. Freud also attempted to link it to biological disposition to self-destruction, tracing a parallel of the psychological attraction of the, quote, nirvana principle, close quote, with the physiological mechanism of self-destruction in biology. In effect, the biological function of apoptosis, the controlled orders for self-destruction of certain cells, may be seen as one illustration of such a biological mechanism. While it may be tempting to explain psychological functions by analogical ones from biology, this runs the risk of reductionism by relating complex phenomena at widely different structural levels to each other. What we do have is the powerful clinical evidence for severe, relentless self-destructiveness in many cases of psychopathology. If anything, the experience with severe types of character pathology and the borderline conditions in the last 30 years has given even further evidence to the fundamental nature of deep self-destructive tendencies in human beings that clinically would support the concept of a death drive. If we accept that severe self-destructiveness functions as a major motivational system, we may explain from this perspective the concept of the death drive. In my view, one solution to the theoretical challenge is a combination of several conclusions. First, if death drive is a designation for the dominant unconscious motivation towards self-destructiveness in severe cases of psychopathology, this concept is undoubtedly warranted. Second, severe self-destructive aggression, however, is not a primary tendency as far as we can tell, but a particularly grave, organized motivational system that is not simply, quote, secondary to trauma, close quote, although it may be influenced and stimulated by traumatic experience. Third, the unconscious functions of self-destructiveness are not simply to destroy the self, but very essentially to destroy significant others as well, be it out of guilt, revenge, envy, or triumph. Exploring jointly the clinical constellations that reflect most clearly the dominance of self-destructive impulses, they all reveal intrapsychic struggles between internalized sadistic representations of objects and masochistically submitting representations of self. Internalized sadistic object representations may represent both projected and reintrojected aggressive impulses and realistic traumatic experiences, while masochistic self-representation may represent a combination of erotization of painful traumatic experiences and unconscious guilt-induced expiational suffering. In the case of repetition compulsion, I've referred to the unconscious identification with perpetrator and victim of a traumatic past, the unconscious identification with a dead mother, and the triumph over a potentially helpful yet envied object by destruction of the self. In the case of sadomasochistic pathology, the strong predominance of aggressive conflicts may turn the internalized relations with the sadistic object into overwhelming self-destructiveness. In the case of negative therapeutic reaction, the spectrum of self-directed aggression may vary from the superego-induced attacks on the self in better integrated patients to the primitive intrapsychic relation with the battering object of dependency. Freud and Melanie Klein's clarification of the psychopathology of suicidal depression first pointed to the self-destructive consequences of a sadistic superego. So what is sought in self-destructive motivation is not simply, quote, nirvana, close quote, but active destruction of significant relations with significant others. In short, aggression as a major motivational system is always present in the mind, based on the integration of primary negative affects. But I propose that it deserves the designation of death drive only when such aggression becomes dominant, when it recruits libidinal impulses, such in the syndrome of perversity, and when its main objective is, to use Andre Green's terms, the achievement of de-objectalization, the elimination of the representations of all significant others, and in that context, the elimination of the self as well. The death drive I propose is not a primary drive, but represents a significant complication of aggression as a major motivational system, is central in the therapeutic work with severe psychopathology, and as such is eminently useful as a concept in the clinical realm. This brings us, of course, to the question of the therapeutic implications of this conceptualization. Where do we stand? What has psychoanalysis achieved in this regard? Under the influence of contemporary object relations theory, psychoanalytic structural theory has evolved into the analysis of the building blocks of ego, superego, and id, namely their constituent internalized relations with significant others that are integrated in the form of primitive, affectively determined representations of self and significant others or objects. I have proposed the dyadic representation of self and others under the dominance of a particular affective valence are internalized as a parallel series of positive and negative internalized object relations. They consolidate according to their specific functions into superego structure when they have a commanding or prohibitive quality, or into ego structures when they correspond to potentially conscious and preconscious identifications in the organization of character formation, and id structures when such internalized object relations correspond to primitive, aggressive, or erotic, fantasy, desired, and feared relation with object that cannot be tolerated in consciousness. The importance of this reformulation of the psychic structures in terms of the internalization of object relation relies in the fact that in the most primitive types of structures that we find in severe psychopathologies, such as early split, idealized, and persecutory object relations, dominate the transferential field rather than the manifestations of mature ego and superego functions, and the treatment has to be centered in the analysis of each of these dyadic units as they emerge in the transference. Regarding our understanding of this psychopathology, perhaps the greatest advance in recent years has been the treatment of severe character pathologies, particularly narcissistic and the borderline conditions. In typical cases of predominantly self-destructive efforts in the transference, behind what appears to be a disdainful rejection and ruthless tearing apart of the analyst's interpretive interventions, the problem is not simple manifestation of the death drive, but its reflection in an internalized object relation between a sadistic, murderous object representation and a submissive, paralyzed representation of self that enters into collusion with the aggressor. It is the collusive aspect of the self that at first becomes evident in the patient's manifest ignoring of the analyst's intervention and the lack of concern for himself. The unconscious pleasure in the defeat of the analyst out of hate or envy emerges more slowly in the transference situation. The analyst's tolerance of such regressive transferences is the key to their eventual resolution. Our application of psychoanalytic principles to the descriptive and structural characteristics of these patients has permitted a clearer indication of differential treatments based on a psychoanalytic modality. It is important to diagnose early syndromes in which severe self-destructive aggression may dominate. They include particularly the syndrome of a dead mother that I referred to, the syndrome of malignant narcissism, cases with severe egosyntonic aggression manifest in arrogance, perversity, and identification with the sadistic superego, as well as self-destructive behavior that affects patients' survival in their social environment. With these cases, it would seem essential to analyze the development of such self-aggressive tendencies in the transference from the very beginning of the treatment, with particular attention paid to tendency to destroy what is provided by the analyst and to whatever hope the patient may have for the survival of the therapist in spite of the patient's aggression. It may become important to structure the treatment in the sense of assuring the stability of its boundaries. We have learned how to prevent severe physical acting out of aggression that would threaten the treatment boundaries by careful initial contract setting and to analyze any counter-transferential deviation from technical neutrality that is from the normal attitude of concerned objectivity of the analyst as a result of intensive hostile transferences. It may become particularly important to explore the pleasure in the patient's aggression against the self and others. In this regard, we might say that the death drive is not inconsistent with the pleasure principle, as evidenced by the triumphant pleasure these patients get in defeating all efforts to help them. I've suggested in earlier work that it is important to transform psychopathic transferences in which the patient manifests dishonesty or dangerous withholding, and perverse transferences in which the patient tries to recruit the benign efforts of the therapist for malignant purposes. We have to transform these psychopathic transferences in paranoid ones, that is, to analyze why the patient has to behave in a deceptive way to avoid deep fear and suspiciousness of the analyst onto whom such aggressive impulses are projected. Full development of paranoid transferences is the first step to a gradual recognition of the projection, the acknowledgement of the origin of aggression in oneself, and the development of depressive transferences, that is, transference in which, under the influence of the development of guilt feelings related to the recognition of his own aggression, the patient may be able to integrate and elaborate his aggressive tendencies. In some cases, one needs to be alert to both absence of affects or absence of representations in what may appear to be, quote, pure, close quote, affects, so that both affect storms on the one hand and apparent total absence of affect have to be explored systematically to unveil the underlying activated object relations. Some cases with extended therapeutic stalemates in reality are deadly repetitions of self-destructive efforts to escape conflicts and to deny the passage of time. There are times where, under the influence of extreme aggressive impulses and their projection, the reality testing of patients decreases. The patient may develop micropsychotic episodes in the sessions, and it may become important for the analyst to spell out the existence of incompatible realities in which patient and analyst live, how to understand them, and how to resolve them. In short, an object relations perspective on the predominance of severely self-destructive transferences has provided analytic tools to treat such patients. And thank you for your attention.
Are there questions, Dr. Kernberg, on life, on death?
Thank you so much. That was marvelous. A question on the nirvana principle. In the East, there is a self-destructiveness that could be called ego destruction, and in a way that to them is non-pathological. Is this of interest to us in the West, and how so?
I'm not sure I understood the question. In the East, there is a
ego, like the Buddhist ego elimination, a separate ego. Is that self-destructiveness? Is that ego just an introject?
My knowledge about Buddhism is very limited, but from what I know, it's not a destructiveness of an aspect of the personality, but the effort to eliminate motivated concern for self that obstructs one's unity with the universe, with the environment, is an effort to eliminate, for the time being, all consideration of one's own desires, wishes, concerns, fears, and be attentive to a spiritual relation with the world in total. That doesn't have the implication of eliminating the live, creative, and valid aspect of self, but an aspect of the personality that may act as a veil hiding our commonality with the world, with others. So I don't think the concept of death drive applies there. This concept, this Buddhist concept, has emerged recently in cognitive behavioral psychology in the concept of mindfulness, which is a move of cognitive behavior therapy toward subjective exploration slowly they are moving in several ways, discovering the transference and the importance of subjectivity. But it should not be confused with self-reflectiveness, which is a contemporary psychoanalytic concept, because self-reflectiveness involves a more realistic view of self and others, of a more realistic view of self-experience, self-concept, and of that of others, so that there's an object-relation perspective in self-reflectiveness which is not contained in mindfulness, which is not a death drive, but eliminates the concrete specific relation with significant others.
Dr. Kernberg, I just want to say, I want to say on behalf of all of us that this was a marvelous, marvelous paper and lecture. And I think I'm speaking for many that your work and your contributions have been a lifetime of mentoring and guiding for many of us. And when you were just speaking, I was thinking I recently reread a paper of yours. It was Barriers to Falling, to Falling and Remaining in Love. And it's a marvelous paper. And it takes in all the, I guess, levels of intrapsychic organization, and you're using the libidinal and aggressive drives in a very fascinating way, and you're expanding on it, I think, this evening. And what I want to say is in appreciation of this paradigm that you're bringing in, it seems that we're looking at the meaning of the death drive as it integrates with the intrapsychic and object relations and affective theory. That I think what it feels like is that you're extending what is the aggressive drive and making and extending it into something that makes the death drive more understandable, because it's taking place within an intrapsychic organization. And I think it, in a sense, makes it much more understandable and much more treatment-oriented. And I think we are also grateful for that. And the other thing I want to say is, as we look at the culture today, and we are watching this tremendous aggressive aspect to the world, and I was thinking when you were speaking on the group psychology, the Freudian paper, that we're also looking at what happened here with the World Trade Center, and we're so apparently aware of the idealization of political figure and how easy it is to become a group, mutual group, and become quite aggressive and watch our own aggression in some sense under our own feet. And I think that you bring up so many aspects of that as well. So I want to thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Let me say that, just to comment on one aspect, that my thinking about the relation between affects and drive really, I must confess, stems from the contemporary biology, in which the traditional concept of instinct has been changed under the influence of Lawrence and Tinbergen and Wilson, in the sense that there are inborn behavioral, perceptive, behavioral, affective mechanisms that are triggered by environmental influences, and as these inborn dispositions are triggered by the environment, they establish a chain of sequence of behavior that then constitutes the instinct. So the instinct is the product of interaction between instinctive dispositions, triggers, and environmental factors. Now, I try to apply this to psychoanalytic theory, considering affect as the instinctive dispositions for which we have ample evidence, and affect theory has evolved more significantly in the last 20 years, and to think of the drive as the sequence of organized affective responses that are organized in terms of unconscious meanings, and so the drive is constituted on the basis of affects. So it seems to me that that fits harmoniously with new developments in biology, as well as psychoanalytic object relations theory. I would also, just one note of warning, I have referred to biological correlations and our own findings, but there's always an enormous danger of two temptations, a reductionism of saying, hyperactivity of the amygdala means that's why we get angry, leaving aside all the complex intermediate development of unconscious motivations and transformations, etc. So we have to protect ourselves against reductionism, particularly at a time when there are so many new developments every day in neurobiology. And the other is, I'm just saying this because there's unfortunately a certain tendency in the psychoanalytic field to look for new discoveries in neurobiology as demonstrations that Freud was right. We are not interested in demonstrating that Freud was right, but in really understanding better the boundaries between mind and brain.
Yes, Dr. Kernberg, if I could just go back to the point about neurobiology that you raised, especially the hyperactivation of the amygdala. I've been familiar with research done by Van der Kolk on trauma and the brain. And I saw one of his presentations where there are actually some functions in the left brain, in the prefrontal cortex, that in PET scans, you could actually see the functions go offline, that there's insufficient blood flow, and the functions are deactivated. There's some neurobiologists that say that the ongoing secretion of corticosteroids under stress atrophies the synaptic connections, some of the synaptic connections of the brain. Now, all of this seems to impact on the arousal level, the affective arousal level, especially in sessions where there is great difficulty in modulating the upsurge of intense affective arousal during the stress states where you have to interpret or confront certain dynamics in the patient. So I was wondering, in the last 10 or 20 years, have you made any modifications as a consequence of this difficulty in going into hyperarousal, very high arousal, or dissociative states where there's something needed in the interaction beyond interpretation? Have you made any modifications in your technique to address these issues, or do you feel it's still too soon to address these issues?
Our group have had limited experience with the treatment of dissociative state. We have experience, but not enough.
Even in the borderline states with the rages.
I'm talking about dissociative state, but in terms of affect storms, these are, of course, our daily bread. And what we have developed are really technical approaches to dealing with affect storms that are quite effective. In essence, if a patient, they are mostly negative even when they are sexual. We make sure when the patient threatens boundaries that have been established by definition, namely that the hour starts a certain time, ends a certain time, the patient is not supposed to attack or damage property, to attack or damage the therapist, not to behave in ways that imply a socially unacceptable sexual behavior, strip, or try to take the shirt off the therapist. We have a treatment of a patient. While we were videotaping, a woman who insisted that she was interested in the therapist and started tearing off his shirt. So we have lots of experience. A patient of mine who was throwing tea, cups full of tea, onto my pictures, which I don't particularly appreciate. And so the first thing we do is point out to the patient that regardless of how they feel, this is not accepted, period. If this doesn't stop immediately, it's the end of a session. And it's remarkable how well to a firmly expressed decision. Of course, once you decide that, the next thing, you can only do that if you have the authority, if you have the power to throw the patient out. You give no order without knowing ahead that it's going to be obeyed. That we learn from the military. I'm joking. So first thing, you establish boundaries. You don't let the patient destroy property. Sometimes you can't avoid it, but then you stop the patient, you stop the hour and the patient has to pay for it. A patient of mine, before I had a chance to react, cut all the plants, came with a pair of scissors and cut all the plants in my office. And that went too fast, or a patient smashed the door. So usually when the therapist has a sense, whatever happens, I will not tolerate the passage of these boundaries. That takes away unrealistic fear of the therapist. If a patient, if the patient is a violent, big, strong person, the therapist has a sense he may be attacked by the patient and wouldn't be able to contain that, then it's simply a matter of telling the patient, we have to stop the session because your behavior evokes fear in me and I cannot work under such conditions. It's very effective. I'm talking about extreme cases. If that is enough so that, and the patient can't yell so that nobody else on the same floor can work, that's another boundary when you're in an institution. However, there may be certain patients of a degree of violence who cannot be treated on an outpatient basis, who cannot be treated by somebody in a private practice, who can be treated if you have an office in the hospital. Some of us have offices in the hospital that makes it easier. And so one has to evaluate ahead of time, can I deal with this patient in my private practice if in worst case scenario? If that can be contained, then we first tell the patient, we understand the patient is extremely enraged. We try to just describe the mental state of the patient. If the patient can tolerate, the patient may say, don't say anything, the patient may yell at us, shut up. Then we say nothing and just wait until things calm down. If the patient can tolerate that, the next step is we tell the patient, we want to share with you what my understanding is, what's motivating your reaction. Can you tolerate my talking about that? So the patient has a chance of expressing what he can tolerate. So gradually we can contextualize the patient's affect, what he is reacting to in his image of the therapist, and that given the fact that he has that view of the therapist, it is absolutely logical that he should react that way. the next question is, does this correspond to reality, or is something unrealistic of which the patient is not aware? So the next step is usually in a reversal. The same patients who are violent are afraid that one is going to destroy them, betray them, and one points out, oh, we are right back where we were, except that now I'm the gorilla and you are the victim. So we analyze the double identification with the victim and victimizer in sequence. So now we are in our next research project, we are planning to look more in detail the correlation between the clinical situation and the relation between limbic system and prefrontal cortex. Presumably, what we're doing is strengthening the cognitive functions of the cortical aspects of cognitive function, but that needs to be demonstrated empirically. We are not at that point. There are fundamental theoretical questions in this area which haven't been answered. To what extent are such extreme violent repetition compulsion modifiable through by modifying it in itself, primitive ingrained brain patterns, or to what extent are there later layers of new experience that dominate it? That's interesting, and we don't know. But that's an interesting question that will be explored, I'm sure. Also, one has to keep in mind that right now the neurobiology of affect is really in an early stage. We thought 10 years ago we knew it all with the neuroamines, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and then came the central opioids and substance P, and now we have about 20 transmitters, and many of them we don't know the functions yet, so things are getting more complex, not only in the area of personality, also when it comes to the theories of depression. So we're at the beginning.
Thank you. Dr. Kernberg, we have our last question we have time for over here. Dr. Beyer.
Good evening, Dr. Kernberg, Dr. Beyer. I have a question that I think leads us full circle and also, I believe, to the core of your paper. Because you, from my understanding of your presentation, is you really link the notion of a death drive that you modified in terms of a not a primary drive, but a secondary phenomenon. And when you gave us sort of the punchline, you referred to the self-destructive behavior and also used Andre Green's de-objectalization. When I hear self-destructive, I am the patients that I work with that are self-destructive. Typically, my experience is that they actually are struggling to have a self. Struggling to have a self. They do not feel that they actually have a self. In terms of an identity. And the experience is very much one of wanting to destroy the false selves that they have. And the objects that are seeming to be enemies that should be destroyed, the de-objectalization is in the service of trying to get rid of everything that destroys them. So it's a self-destructive tendency, but it really aims at getting rid of the voices that tell them who they are or whatever. So in light of that experience, in light of that clinical experience, I want to go to the heart of the question of your discussion, also of our series here, namely, do we really need to think of drive, or could we potentially rephrase your whole argument in terms of self-psychology? So that's my question. Thank you.
I think I have a sense that you've raised two questions. One, whether we need the concept of drive and can replace it, did you say, by self-psychology? Yeah, that's one issue. And the other is whether the self-destructiveness is not directed against the bad self to salvage a good self, right?
Yes. And these are back to the first question in a way of Buddhism, because that's where that is very much a discussion.
So let me first answer whether they are trying to destroy bad self to salvage the good part of the self. There are patients with self-destructiveness who clearly have that kind of dynamic. That is true particularly for suicidal behavior and severe depression. As Melanie Klein has pointed out, the patient has the fantasy that by killing himself he will be destroying all that is bad and will protect the good objects from his bad self, and at the bottom, with this, it will be his own salvation and redemption, and the good self will be saved by his death. So that is clearly dynamic in severe depression, severe suicidal depression. I would say in the milder cases of negative therapeutic reaction, but in severe self-mutilating patients with malignant narcissism, there is no integrated good self, nothing that one can preserve. That is not yet there because it is split off, so that dynamic doesn't go for the large majority, for the most self-destructive patients. That would be response to one part. Second, whether to replace a drive theory by self-psychology, well, that there has been effort to do that. Corwood really was, I think, was the most courageous and radical of the thinkers who tried to replace drive theory with self-psychology. But already his disciples had to bring in negative self-objects, not only self-objects that had to be strengthened, but negative introjects were reintroduced. And to state that aggression is a product of decomposition of the self doesn't fit with many clinical observations, certainly not with the biology of aggression. That is normal, as I mentioned, instinct in animals. So from the most general biological perspective, it's questionable. From a directly clinical one in terms of negative introjects, and from a broader viewpoint, because one of the consequences of self-psychology has been a clear neglect of the analysis of aggressive conflicts and of sexuality. It tends to underestimating the importance of primitive sexuality and its linkage with sadomasochism. At least as far as you can tell from the literature, the treatment of narcissistic patients by self-psychological means produces an improvement by normalization or better adaptation of the pathological grandiose self, but not by its decomposition. And an analytic approach that tries to deconstruct analytically the pathological grandiose self leads not to wild aggression as a decomposition product, but to the activation of the primitive, idealized, and persecutory relationships that have been described in Kleinian theory. So for all these reasons, I don't think we can replace drive theory. They point to that fundamental polarity of the struggle between love and hatred that we find at every level, in every corner, whatever the conflict, in high-level neurotic and borderline patients at least. That's my experience, and I think it corresponds to a majority of people who work with severe personality disorders, both here and abroad, I would say.
Thank you very much.